The Old Chest at Wyther Grange. When I was a child, I always thought that a visit to Wyther Grange was a great treat. It was a big, quiet, old-fashioned house where Grandmother Lawrence and Mrs. Delisle, my Aunt Winifred, lived. I was a favourite with them, yet I could never overcome a certain awe of both of them. Grandmother was a tall, dignified old lady with keen black eyes that seemed veritably to bore through one. She always wore stiffly rustling gowns of rich silk made in the fashion of her youth. I suppose she must have changed her dress occasionally, but the impression on my mind was always the same, that she went trailing about the house with a bunch of keys at her belt, keys that opened a score of wonderful old chests and boxes and drawers. It was one of my dearest delights to attend Grandmother in her peregrinations and watch the unfolding and examining of all those old treasures and heirlooms of bygone Lawrences. Of Aunt Winifred I was less in awe, possibly because she dressed in a modern way, and so looked to my small eyes more human and natural. As Winifred Lawrence, she had been the beauty of the family, and was a handsome woman still, with brilliant dark eyes and cameo-like features. She always looked very sad, spoke in a low, sweet voice, and was my childish ideal of all that was high-bred and graceful. I had many beloved haunts at the Grange, but I liked the garret best. It was a roomy old place, big enough to have comfortably housed a family in itself, and was filled with cast-off furniture and old trunks and boxes of discarded finery. I was never tired of playing there, dressing up in the old-fashioned gowns and hats, and practising old-time dance steps before the high, cracked mirror that hung at one end. That old garret was a veritable fairyland to me. There was one old chest which I could not explore, and like all forbidden things, it possessed a great attraction for me. It stood away back in a dusty cobweb corner, a strong high wooden box painted blue. From some words which I had heard Grandmother let fall, I was sure it had a history. It was the one thing she never explored in her periodical overhaulings. When I grew tired of playing, I liked to creep up on it and sit there, picturing out my own fancies concerning it, of which my favourite one was that some day I should solve the riddle and open the chest to find it full of gold and jewels, with which I might restore the fortune of the Lawrences and all the traditionary splendours of the old Grange. I was sitting there one day when Aunt Winifred and Grandmother Lawrence came up the narrow, dark staircase, the latter jingling her keys and peering into the dusty corners as she came along the room. When they came to the old chest, Grandmother rapped the top smartly with her keys. "I wonder what is in this old chest," she said. "I believe it really should be opened. The moths may have got into it through that crack in the lid." "Why don't you open it, Mother?" said Mrs. Delisle. "I'm sure that key of Robert's would fit the lock." "No," said Grandmother, in a tone that nobody, not even Aunt Winifred, ever dreamed of disputing. "I will not open that chest without Eliza's permission. She confined it to my care when she went away, and I promised that it should never be opened until she came for it." "Poor Eliza," said Mrs. Delisle thoughtfully. "I wonder what she is like now. Very much changed, like all the rest of us, I suppose. It is almost 30 years since she was here. How pretty she was." "I never approved of her," said Grandmother brusquely. "She was a sentimental, fanciful creature. She might have married well, but she preferred to waste her life pining over the memory of a man who was not worthy to untie the shoelace of a Lawrence." Mrs. Delisle sighed softly and made no reply. People said that she had had her own romance in her youth, and that her mother had sternly repressed it. I had heard that her marriage with Mr. Delisle was loveless on her part, and proved very unhappy, but he had been dead many years, and Aunt Winifred never spoke of him. "I have made up my mind what to do," said Grandmother decidedly. "I will write to Eliza and ask her if I may open the chest to see if the moths have got into it. If she refuses, well and good. I have no doubt that she will refuse. She will cling to her old sentimental ideas as long as the breath is in her body." I rather avoided the chest after this. It took on a new significance in my eyes, and seemed to me like the tomb of something, possibly some dead and buried romance of the past. Later on, a letter came to Grandmother. She passed it over the table to Mrs. Delisle. "That is from Eliza," she said. "I would know her writing anywhere. None of your modern, sprawly, untidy hands, but a fine, lady-like script, as regular as copper plate. Read the letter, Winifred. I haven't my glasses, and I dare say Eliza's rhapsodies would tire me very much. You need not read them aloud. I can imagine them all. Let me know what she says about the chest." Aunt Winifred opened and read the letter, and laid it down with a brief sigh. "This is all she says about the chest. If it were not for one thing that is in it, I would ask you to open the chest and burn all its contents. But I cannot bear that anyone but myself should see or touch that one thing. So please leave the chest as it is, dear Aunt. It is no matter if the moths do get in. That is all," continued Mrs. Delisle, "and I must confess that I am disappointed. I have always had an almost childish curiosity about that old chest, but I seem fated not to have it gratified. That one thing must be her wedding dress. I have always thought that she locked it away there. Her answer is just what I expected of her, said grandmother impatiently. Evidently the years have not made her more sensible. Well, I wash my hands of her belongings, moths or no moths. It was not until 10 years afterwards that I heard anything more of the old chest. Grandmother Lawrence had died, but Aunt Winifred still lived at the Grange. She was very lonely, and the winter after grandmother's death she sent me an invitation to make her a long visit. When I revisited the garret and saw the old blue chest in the same dusty corner, my childish curiosity revived, and I begged Aunt Winifred to tell me its history. "I'm glad you've reminded me of it," said Mrs. Delisle. "I have intended to open the chest ever since Mother's death, but I kept putting it off. You know, Amy, poor Eliza Lawrence died 5 years ago, but even then Mother would not have the chest opened. If you like, we will go and open it at once, and afterwards I will tell you the story." We went eagerly up the garret stairs. Aunt knelt down before the old chest and selected a key from the bunch at her belt. "Would it not be too provoking, Amy, if this key should not fit after all? Well, I do not believe you should be any more disappointed than I." She turned the key and lifted the heavy lid. I bent forward eagerly. A layer of tissue paper revealed itself, and a fine tracing of sifted dust in its crinkles. "Lift it up, my child," said my aunt gently. "There are no ghosts for you, at least in this old chest." I lifted the paper up and saw that the chest was divided into 2 compartments. Lying on the top one was a small, square, inlaid box. This Mrs. Delisle took up and carried to the window. Lifting up the cover, she laid it on my lap. "There, Amy, look through it, and let us see what old treasures have lain hidden there these 40 years. The first thing I took out was a small square case covered with dark purple velvet. The tiny clasp was almost rusted away and yielded easily. I gave a cry of admiration. Aunt Winifred bent over my shoulder. "That is Eliza's portrait at the age of 20, and that is Willis Starr's. Was she not lovely, Amy?" Lovely indeed was the face looking out at me from its border of tarnished gilt. It was the face of a young girl in shape of a perfect oval, with delicate features and large dark eyes. Her hair caught high on the crown and falling on her neck in the long curls of a bygone fashion was a warm auburn, and the curves of her bare neck and shoulders were exquisite. The other picture is that of the man whom she was betrothed to. Tell me, Amy, do do you think him handsome?" I looked at the other portrait critically. It was that of a young man of about 25. He was undeniably handsome, but there was something I did not like in his face, and I said so. Aunt Winifred made no reply. She was taking out the remaining contents of the box. There was a white silk fan with delicately carved ivory sticks, a packet of old letters, and a folded paper containing some dried and crumpled flowers. Aunt laid the box aside and unpacked the chest in silence. First came a ball dress of pale yellow satin brocade, made with the trained skirt, baby waist and full puff sleeves of a former generation. Beneath it was a case containing a necklace of small but perfect pearls, and a pair of tiny satin slippers. The rest of the compartment was filled with household linen, fine and costly, but yellowed with age, damask table linen and webs of uncut fabric. In the second compartment lay a dress. Aunt Winifred lifted it out reverently. It was a gown of rich silk that had once been white, but now, like the linen, it was yellow with age. It was simply made and trimmed with cobwebby old lace. Wrapped around it was a long white bridal veil, redolent with some strange old-time perfume that had kept its sweetness all through the years. "Well, Amy, this is all," said Aunt Winifred, with a quiver in her voice. "And now for the story. Where shall I begin?" "At the very beginning, Auntie. You see, I know nothing at all except her name. Tell me who she was, and why she put her wedding dress away here." "Poor Eliza," said Aunt dreamily. "It is a sorrowful story, Amy, and it seems so long ago. I must be an old woman. 40 years ago, and I was only 20 then. Eliza Lawrence was my cousin, the only daughter of Uncle Henry Lawrence. My father, your grandfather, Amy, you don't remember him, had 2 brothers, each of whom had an only daughter. Both these girls were called Eliza, after your great-grandmother. I never saw Uncle George's Eliza but once. He was a rich man, and his daughter was much sought after. But she was no beauty, I promise you that, and proud and vain to the last degree. Her home was in a distant city, and she never came to Wyther Grange. The other Eliza Lawrence was a poor man's daughter. She and I were of the same age, and did not look unlike each other, although I was not so pretty by half. You can see by the portrait how beautiful she was, and it does her scant justice, for half her charm lay in her arch expression and her vivacious ways. She had her little faults, of course, and was rather overmuch given to romance and sentiment, This did not seem much of a defect to me then, Amy, for I was young and romantic too. Mother never cared much for Eliza, I think, but everyone else liked her. One winter Eliza came to Wyther Grange for a long visit. The Grange was a very lively place then, Amy. Eliza kept the old house ringing with merriment. We went out a great deal, and she was always the belle of any festivity we attended. Yet she wore her honours easily. All the flattery and homage she received did not turn her head. That winter we first met Willis Starr. He was a newcomer, and nobody knew much about him, but one or two of the best families took him up, and his own fascinations did the rest. He became what you would call the rage. He was considered very handsome, and his manners were very polished and easy, and people said he was rich. I don't think, Amy, that I ever trusted Willis Starr, but like all the rest, I was blinded by his charm. Mother was almost the only one who did not worship at his shrine, and very often she dropped hints about penniless adventurers that made Eliza very indignant. From the first he had paid Eliza marked attention, and seemed utterly bewitched by her. Well, his was an easy winning. Eliza loved him with her whole impulsive girlish heart, and made no attempt to hide it. I shall never forget the night they were first engaged. It was Eliza's birthday, and we were invited to a ball that evening. This yellow gown is the very one she wore. I suppose that is why she put it away here. The gown she wore on the happiest night of her life. I had never seen her look more beautiful. Her neck and arms were bare, and she wore this string of pearls and carried a bouquet of her favourite white roses. When we reached home after the dance, Eliza had her happy secret to tell us. She was engaged to Willis Starr, and they were to be married in the early spring. Willis Starr certainly seemed to be the ideal lover, and Eliza was so perfectly happy that she seemed to grow more beautiful and radiant every day. Well, Amy, the wedding day was set. Eliza was to be married from the Grange, as her own mother was dead, and I was to be bridesmaid. We made her wedding dress together, she and I. Girls were not above making their own gowns then, and not a stitch was set in Eliza's save those put there by loving fingers and blessed by loving wishes. It was I who draped the veil over her sunny curls. See how yellow and creased it is now, but it was as white as snow that day. A week before the wedding, Willis Starr was spending the evening at the Grange. We were all chattering gaily about the coming event, and speaking of invited guests, Eliza said something about the other Eliza Lawrence, the great heiress, looking archly at Willis over her shoulder as she spoke. It was some merry bandyage about the cousin whose namesake she was, but whom she so little resembled. We all laughed, but I shall never forget the look that came over Willis Starr's face. It passed quickly, but the chill fear that it gave me remained. A few minutes later I left the room on some trifling errand, and as I returned through the dim hall, I was met by Willis Starr. He laid his hand on my arm and bent his evil face, for it was evil then, Amy, close to mine. "Tell me," he said, in a low but rude tone, "is there another Eliza Lawrence who is an heiress?" "Certainly there is," I said sharply. "She is our cousin, and the daughter of our Uncle George. Our Eliza is not an heiress. You surely did not suppose she was?" Willis stepped aside with a mocking smile. "I did. What wonder? I had heard much about the great heiress Eliza Lawrence, and the great beauty Eliza Lawrence. I supposed they were one and the same. You have all been careful not to undeceive me." "You forget yourself, Mr. Starr, when you speak so to me," I retorted coldly. "You have deceived yourself. We have never dreamed of allowing anyone to think that Eliza was an heiress. She is sweet and lovely enough to be loved for her own sake." I went back to the parlour full of dismay. Willis Starr remained gloomy and taciturn all the rest of the evening, but nobody seemed to notice but myself. The next day we were all so busy that I almost forgot the incident of the previous evening. We girls were up in the sewing room, putting the last touches to the wedding gown. Eliza tried it and her veil on, and was standing so in all her silken splendour when a letter was brought in. I guessed by her blush who was the writer, and I laughed and ran downstairs, leaving her to read it. When I returned, she was still standing just where I had left her, in the middle of the room, holding the letter in her hand. Her face was as white as her veil, and her wide open eyes had a dazed, agonized look as of someone who had been stricken a mortal blow. All the soft happiness and sweetness had gone out of them. They were the eyes of an old woman, Amy. "Eliza, what is the matter?" I said. "Has anything happened to Willis?" She made no answer, but walked up to the fireplace, dropped the letter in a bed of writhing blue flame, and watched it burn to white ashes. Then she turned to me. "Help me take off this gown, Winnie," she said dully. "I shall never wear it again. There will be no wedding. Willis is gone." "Gone?" I echoed stupidly. "Yes, I am not the heiress, Winnie. It was the fortune, not the girl he loved. He says he is too poor for us to dream of marrying when I have nothing. Oh, such a cruel, heartless letter. Why did he not kill me? It would have been so much more merciful I loved him so. I trusted him so. Oh, Winnie, Winnie, what am I to do? There was something terrible in the contrast between her passionate words and her calm face and lifeless voice. I wanted to call Mother, but she would not let me. She went away to her own room, trailing along the dark hall in her dress and veil, and locked herself in. Well, I told it all to the others in some fashion. You can imagine their anger and dismay. Your father, Amy, he was a hot-blooded, impetuous young fellow then, went at once to seek Willis Starr. But he was gone. No one knew where, and the whole country rang with gossip and scandal of the affair. Eliza knew nothing of this, for she was ill and unconscious for many a day. In a novel or story she would have died, I suppose, and that would have been the end of it. But this is real life, and Eliza did not die, although many times we thought she would. When she did recover, how frightfully changed she was. It almost broke my heart to see her. Her very nature seemed to have changed too. All her joyousness and light-heartedness were dead. From that time she was a faded, dispirited creature, no more like the Eliza we had known than the merest stranger. And then, after a while, came the other news. Willis Starr was married to the other Eliza Lawrence, the true heiress. He made no second mistake. We tried to keep it from Eliza, but she found out at last. That was the day she came up here alone and packed this old chest. Nobody ever knew just what she put into it, but you and I see now, Amy, her ball dress, her wedding gown, her love letters, and more than all else, her youth and happiness. This old chest is the tomb of all of it. Eliza Lawrence was really buried here. She went home soon afterwards. Before she went, she exacted a promise from Mother that the old chest would be left at the Grange, unopened until she came for it herself. But she never came back, and I do not think she ever intended to, and I never saw her again. That is the story of the old chest. It was all over so long ago, the heartbreak and the misery, but it all seems to come back to me now. Poor Eliza. My own eyes were full of tears as Aunt Winifred went down the stairs, leaving me sitting dreamily there in the sunlight, with the old yellowed bridal veil across my lap, and the portrait of Eliza Lawrence in my hand. Around me were the relics of her pitiful story, the old, oft-repeated story of a faithless love and a woman's broken heart, the gown she had worn, the slippers in which she had danced light-heartedly at her betrothal ball, her fan, her pearls, her gloves, and it somehow seemed to me as if I were living in those old years myself, as if the love and happiness and the betrayal and pain were part of my own life. Presently Aunt Winifred came back through the twilight shadows. "Let us put all these things back in their grave, Amy," she said. "They are of no use to anyone now. The linen might be bleached and used, I dare say, but it would seem like a sacrilege. It was Mother's wedding present to Eliza. And the pearls, would you care to have them, Amy?" "Oh, no, no," I said with a little shiver. "I would never wear them, Aunt Winifred. I should feel like a ghost if I did. Put everything back just as we found it. Only her portrait. I would like to keep that." Reverently we put gowns and letters and trinkets back in the old blue chest. Aunt Winifred closed the lid and turned the key softly. She bowed her head over it for a minute, and then we went together in silence down the shadowy garret stairs of Wyther Grange. Why Mr. Cropper changed his mind. "Well, Miss Maxwell, how did you get along today?" asked Mr. Baxter affably when the new teacher came to the table. She was a slight, dark girl, rather plain-looking, but with a smart, energetic way. Mr. Baxter approved of her. He liked her style, as he would have said. The summer term had just opened in Maitland District. Esther Maxwell was a stranger, but she was a capable girl, and had no doubt of her own ability to get and keep the school in good working order. She smiled brightly at Mr. Baxter. "Very well for a beginning. The children seem bright and teachable, and not too hard to control." Mr. Baxter nodded. "There are no bad children in the school, except the Cropper boys, and they can be good enough if they like." "Reckon they weren't there today?" "No." "Well, Miss Maxwell, I think it only fair to tell you that you may well have trouble with those boys when they do come. Forewarned is forearmed, you know. Mr. Cropper was opposed to our hiring you. Not, of course, that he had any personal objection to you, but he is set against female teachers, and when a Cropper is set, there is nothing on earth can change him. He says female teachers can't keep order. He started in with a spite at you on general principles, and the boys know it. They know he'll back them in secret, no matter what they do, just to prove his opinions. Cropper is sly and slippery. It is hard to corner him." "Are the boys big?" queried Esther anxiously. "Yes, 13 and 14, and big for their age. You can't whip 'em, that is the trouble. A man might, but they'd twist you around their fingers. You'll have your hands full, I'm afraid. But maybe they'll behave all right after all." Mr. Baxter had no hope that they would, but Esther hoped for the best. She could not believe that Mr. Cropper would carry his prejudices into a personal application. This conviction was strengthened when he overtook her walking from school the next day and drove her home. He was a big, handsome man, with a very suave, polite manner. He asked interestingly about her school and her work, and hoped she was getting on well, and said he had 2 young rascals of his own to send soon. Esther felt relieved. She thought that Mr. Baxter had exaggerated matters a little. That plum tree of Mrs. Charlie's is loaded with fruit again this year, remarked Mr. Baxter at the tea-table that evening. I came past it today on my way, across lots of home from the woods. There'll be bushels of plums on it. I don't suppose poor Mrs. Charlie will get one of them any more than she ever has, says Mrs. Baxter indignantly. It's a burning shame, that's what it is. I just wish she could catch the croppers once. You haven't any proof that it is really them, Mary, objected her husband, and you shouldn't make reckless accusations before folks. I know it very well is them, retorted Mrs. Baxter, and so do you, Adoniram, and Mrs. Charlie knows it too, although she can't prove it, more's the pity. I don't say Isaac Cropper steals those plums with his own hands, but he knows who does, and the plums go into Meritable Cropper's preserving kettle. There's nothing surer. You see, Miss Maxwell, it's this way, explained Mr. Baxter, turning to Esther. Mrs. Charlie Cropper's husband was Isaac's brother. They never got on well together, and when Charlie died there was a tremendous fuss about the property. Isaac acted mean and scandalous clear through, and public opinion has been down on him ever since. But Mrs. Charlie is a pretty smart woman, and he didn't get the better of her in everything. There was a strip of disputed land between the 2 farms, and she secured it. There's a big plum tree growing on it close to the line fence. It's the finest one in Maitland, but Mrs. Charlie never gets a plum from it. But what becomes of them? Asked Esther. They disappear, said Mr. Baxter, with a significant nod. When the plums are anything like ripe, Mrs. Charlie discovers some day that there isn't one left on the tree. She has never been able to get a scrap of proof as to who took them, or she'd make it hot for them. But nobody in Maitland has any doubt in his mind that Isaac Cropper knows where those plums grow. I don't think Mr. Cropper would steal, protested Esther. Well, he doesn't consider it stealing, you know. He claims the land and says the plums are his. I don't doubt that he is quite clear in his own mind that they are, and he does hate Mrs. Charlie. I'd give considerable to see the old sinner fairly caught, but he is too deep. I think Mr. Baxter is too hard on Mr. Cropper, said Esther to herself later on. He probably has some private prejudice against him. But a month later she changed her opinion. During that time the Cropper boys had come to school. At first Esther had been inclined to like them. They were handsome lads with the same smooth way that characterized their father, and seemed bright and intelligent. For a few days all went well, and Esther was decidedly relieved. But before long a subtle spirit of insubordination began to make itself felt in the school. Esther found herself powerless to cope with it. The Croppers never openly defied her, but they did precisely as they pleased. The other pupils thought themselves at liberty to follow this example, and in a month's time poor Esther had completely lost control of her little kingdom. Some complaints were heard among the ratepayers, and even Mr. Baxter looked dubious. She knew that unless she could regain her authority, she would be requested to hand in her resignation, but she was baffled by the elusive system of defiance which the Cropper boys had organised. One day she resolved to go to Mr. Cropper himself and appeal to his sense of justice, if he had any. It had been an especially hard day in school. When she had been absent at the noon hour, all the desks in the schoolroom had been piled in a pyramid on the floor, books and slates interchanged, and various other pranks played. When questioned, every pupil denied having done or helped to do it. Alfred and Bob Cropper looked her squarely in the eyes and declared their innocence in the usual gentlemanly fashion. Yet Esther felt sure that they were the guilty ones. She also knew what exaggerated accounts of the affair would be taken home to Maitland tea-tables, and she felt like sitting down to cry. But she did not. Instead, she set her mouth firmly, helped the children restore the room to order, and after school went up to Isaac Cropper's house. That gentleman himself came in from the harvest field, looking as courtly as usual, even in his rough clothes. He shook hands heartily, told her he was glad to see her, and began talking about the weather. Esther was not to be turned from her object thus, although she felt her courage ebbing away from her, as it always did in the presence of the Cropper imperviousness. "I have come up to see you about Alfred and Robert, Mr. Cropper," she said. "They are not behaving well in school." "Indeed?" Mr. Cropper's voice expressed bland surprise. "That is strange. As a rule, I do not think Alfred and Robert have been troublesome to their teachers. What have they been doing now?" "They refuse to obey my orders," said Esther faintly. "Ah, well, Miss Maxwell, perhaps you will pardon my saying that a teacher should be able to enforce her orders. My boys are high-spirited fellows, and need a strong, firm hand to restrain them. I have always said I considered it advisable to employ a male teacher in Maitland School. We should have better order. Not that I disapprove of you personally. Far from it. I should be glad to see you succeed. But I have heard many complaints regarding the order of school at present." "I had no trouble until your boys came," retorted Esther, losing her temper a little, "and I believe that if you were willing to cooperate with me, that I could govern them." "Well, you see," said Mr. Cropper easily, "when I send my boys to school, I naturally expect that the teacher will be capable of doing the work she has been hired to do." "Then you refuse to help me?" said Esther in a trembling voice. "Why, my dear young lady, what can I do? Boys soon know when they can disobey a teacher with impunity. No doubt you will be able to secure a good school, easier to control, and will do good work. But here, as I have already said, we need a firm hand at the helm." But you're not going yet, Miss Maxwell. You need some refreshment after your long walk. Mrs. Cropper will bring you something." "No, thank you," said poor Esther. She felt she must get away at once, or she would burst into heart-sick tears under those steely, bland blue eyes. When she got home, she shut herself in her room and cried. There was nothing for her to do but resign, she thought dismally. On the following Saturday, Esther went for an afternoon walk, carrying her kodak with her. It was a brilliantly fine autumn day, and woods and fields were basking in a mellow haze. Esther went across lots to Mrs. Charlie Cropper's house, intending to make a call, but the house was locked up and evidently deserted. So she rambled past it to the back fields. Passing through a grove of maples, she came out among leafy young saplings on the other side. Just beyond her, with its laden boughs hanging over the fence line, was the famous plum tree. Esther looked at it for a moment. Then an odd smile gleamed over her face, and she lifted her kodak. Monday evening, Esther called on Mr. Cropper again. After the preliminary remarks in which he indulged, she said, with seeming irrelevance, that Saturday had been a fine day. There was an excellent light for snapshots, she went on coolly. I went out with my kodak and was lucky enough to get a good negative. I have brought you up a proof. I thought you would be interested in it." She rose and placed the proof on the table before Mr. Cropper. The plum tree came out clearly. Bob and Alf Cropper were up among the boughs picking the plums. On the ground beneath them stood their father with a basket of fruit in his hand. Mr. Cropper looked at the proof, and from it to Esther. His eyes had lost their unconcerned glitter, but his voice was defiant. "Those plums are mine by right," he said. "Perhaps," said Esther calmly, "but there are some who do not think so. Mrs. Charlie, for instance. She would like to see this proof, I think." "Don't show it to her," cried Mr. Cropper hastily. "I tell you, Miss Maxwell, those plums are mine, but I'm tired of fighting over them, and I decided before this that I'd let her have them after this. It's only a trifle, anyhow. And about that little matter we were discussing the other night, Miss Maxwell, I've been thinking it over, and I admit I was somewhat unreasonable. I'll talk to Alfred and Robert and see what I can do." "Very well," said Esther quietly. "The matter of the plums isn't my business, and I don't wish to be involved in your family feuds, especially as you say that you mean to allow Mrs. Charlie to enjoy her own in future. As for school, we will hope that matters will improve." "You'll leave the proof with me, won't you?" said Mr. Cropper eagerly. "Oh, certainly," said Esther, smiling. "I have the negative still, you know." From that time out, the Cropper boys were models of good behaviour, and the other turbulent spirits, having lost their leaders, were soon quelled. Complaint died away, and at the end of the term Esther was re-engaged. "You seem to have won old Cropper over to your side entirely," Mr. Baxter told her that night. "He said at the meeting today that you were the best teacher we have ever had, and moved to raise your salary. I never knew Isaac Cropper to change his opinions so handsomely." Esther smiled. She knew it had taken a powerful lever to change Mr. Cropper's opinion, but she kept her own counsel. An Unconventional Confidence. A girl in black and yellow ran frantically down the grey road under the pines. There was nobody to see her, but she would have run if all Halifax had been looking on, for had she not on the loveliest new hat, a creation in yellow chiffon with big black shoe, and a dress to match, and was there not a shower coming straight from the hills across the harbour? Down at the end of the long resinous avenue the girl saw the shore road, with the pavilion shutting out the view of the harbour's mouth. Below the pavilion, clean-shaven George's Island guarded the town like a sturdy bulldog, and beyond it were the wooded hills, already lost in a mist of rain. "Oh, I shall be too late," moaned the girl, but she held her hat steady with one hand and ran on. If she could only reach the pavilion in time. It was a neck-and-neck race between the rain and the girl, but the girl won. Just as she flew out upon the shore road, a tall young man came pelting down the ladder, and they both dashed up the steps of the pavilion together as the rain swooped down upon them and blotted George's Island and the smoky town and the purple banks of the eastern passage from view. The pavilion was small at the best of times, and just now the rain was beating into it on two sides, leaving only one dry corner. Into this the girl moved. She was flushed and triumphant. The young man thought that in all his life he had never seen anyone so pretty. "I'm so glad I didn't get my hat wet," said the girl breathlessly as she straightened it with a careful hand and wondered if she looked very blown and blousy. "It would have been a pity," admitted the young man. "It is a very pretty hat." "Pretty?" The girl looked the scorn her voice expressed. "Anyone can have a pretty hat. Our cook has one. This is a creation." "Of course," said the young man humbly. "I ought to have known, but I am very stupid." "Well, I suppose a mere man couldn't be expected to understand exactly," said the girl graciously. She smiled at him in a friendly fashion, and he smiled back. The girl thought that she had never seen such lovely brown eyes before. He could not be a Haligonian. She was sure she knew all the nice young men with brown eyes in Halifax. "Please sit down," she said plaintively. "I'm tired." The young man smiled again at the idea of his sitting down because the girl was tired. But he sat down, and so did she, on the only dry seat to be found. "Goodness knows how long this rain will last," said the girl, making herself comfortable and picturesque. "But I shall stay here until it clears up. If it rains for a week, I will not have my hat spoiled. I suppose I shouldn't have put it on. Beatrix said it was going to rain. Beatrix is such a horribly good prophet. I detest people who are good prophets. Don't you?" "I think that they are responsible for all the evils that they predict," said the young man solemnly. "That is just what I told Beatrix, and I was determined to put on this hat and come out to the park today. I simply had to come alone, and I knew I'd be alone out here. Everybody else would be at the football game. By the way, why aren't you there?" "I wasn't aware that there was a football game on hand," said the young man, as if he knew he ought to be ashamed of his ignorance, and was. "Dear me," said the girl pityingly. "Where can you have been not to have heard of it? It's between the Dalhousie team and the Wanderers. Almost everyone here is on the Wanderers' side because they are Haligonians, but I am not. I like the college boys best. Beatrix says that it is just because of my innate contrariness. Last year I simply screamed myself hoarse with enthusiasm. The Dalhousie team won the trophy." "If you are so interested in the game, it's a wonder you didn't go to see it yourself," said the young man boldly. "Well, I just couldn't," said the girl with a sigh. "If anybody had told me that there would ever be a football game in Halifax, and that I should elect to prowl about by myself in the park instead of going to it, I'd have laughed them to scorn. Even Beatrix would never have dared to prophesy that. But you see, it has happened. I was too crumpled up in my mind to care about football today. I had to come here and have it out with myself. That is why I put on my hat. I thought perhaps I might get through with my mental gymnastics in time to go to the game afterwards, but I didn't. It's just maddening, too. I got this hat and dress on purpose to wear to it. They're black and yellow, you see, the Dalhousie colours. It was my own idea. I'm sure it would make a sensation. But I couldn't go to the game and take any interest in it, feeling as I do, could I now?" The young man said of course she couldn't. It was utterly out of the question. The girl smiled. Without a smile, she was charming. With a smile, she was adorable. I like to have my opinions bolstered up. Do you know, I want to tell you something. May I? You may. I'll never tell anyone as long as I live, said the young man solemnly. I don't know you, and you don't know me. That is why I want to tell you about it. I must tell somebody, and if I told anybody I knew, they'd tell it all over Halifax. It is dreadful to be talking to you like this. Beatrix would have 3 fits, one after the other, if she saw me. But Beatrix is a slave to conventionality. I glory in discarding it at times. You don't mind, do you? Not at all, said the young man sincerely. The girl sighed. I've reached that point where I must have a confidant or go crazy. Once I could tell things to Beatrix. That was before she got engaged. Now she tells everything to him. There is no earthly way of preventing her. I've tried them all. So nowadays, when I get into trouble, I tell it out loud to myself in the glass. It's a relief, you know. But that is no good now. I want to tell it to somebody who can say things back. Will you promise to say things back? The young man assured her that he would when the proper time came. Very well, but please don't look at me while I'm telling you. I'll be sure to blush in places. When Beatrix wants to be particularly aggravating, she says I have lost the art of blushing. But that is only her way of putting it, you know. Sometimes I blush dreadfully. The young man dragged his eyes from the face under the black and yellow hat and fastened them on a crooked pine that hung over the bank. Well, began the girl, the root of the whole trouble is simply this. There is a young man in England. I always think of him as the creature. He is the son of a man who was father's especial crony in boyhood, before father emigrated to Canada. Worse than that, he comes from a family which has contracted a vile habit of marrying into our family. It has come down through the ages, so long that it has become chronic. Father left most of his musty traditions in England, but he brought this pet one with him. He and his friend agreed that the latter's son should marry one of father's daughters. It ought to have been Beatrix. She is the oldest. But Beatrix has a pug nose, so father settled on me. From my earliest recollection, I have been given to understand that just as soon as I grew up, there would be a ready-made husband imported from England for me. I was doomed to it from my cradle. Now, said the girl with a tragic gesture, I ask you, could anything be more hopelessly, appallingly stupid and devoid of romance as that? The young man shook his head, but did not look at her. It is pretty bad, he admitted. You see, said the girl pathetically, the shadow of it has been over my whole life. Of course, when I was a very little girl, I didn't mind so much. It was such a long way off, and lots of things might happen. The creature might run away with some other girl, or I might have the smallpox, or Beatrix's nose might straighten when she grew up. And if Beatrix's nose were straight, she'd be a great deal prettier than I am. But nothing did happen, and her nose is puggier than ever. Then when I grew up, things were horrid. I never could have a single bit of fun, and Beatrix had such a good time. She had scores of lovers in spite of her nose. To be sure, she's engaged now, and he's a horrid, faddy little creature, but he is her own choice. She wasn't told that there was a man in England whom she must marry by and by. When he got sufficiently reconciled to the idea to come and to ask her, oh, it makes me furious. Is there anyone else? Asked the young man hesitatingly. Oh dear, no. How could there be? Why, you know, I couldn't have the tiniest flirtation with another man when I was as good as engaged to the creature. That is one of my grievances. Just think how much fun I've missed. I used to rage at Beatrix about it, but she would tell me that I ought to be thankful to have the chance of making such a good match. The creature is rich, you know, and clever. As if I cared how clever or rich he is. Beatrix made me so cross that I gave up saying anything and sulked by myself. So they think I'm quite reconciled to it, but I'm not. He might be very nice after all, suggested the young man. Nice? That isn't the point. Oh, don't you see? But no, you're a man. You can't understand. You must just take my word for it. The whole thing makes me furious. But I haven't told you the worst. The creature is on his way out to Canada now. He may arrive here at any minute, and they are all so aggravatingly delighted over it. What do you suppose he feels like? Asked the young man reflectively. Well, said the girl frankly, I've been too much taken up with my own feelings to worry about his, but I dare say they're pretty much like mine. He must loathe and detest the very thought of me. Oh, I don't think he does, said the young man gravely. Don't you? Well, what do you suppose he does think of it all? You ought to understand the man's part better than I can. There's as much difference in men as in women, said the young man in an impersonal tone. I may be right or wrong, you see, but I imagine he would feel something like this. From boyhood he has understood that away out in Canada there is a little girl growing up who is some day to be his wife. She becomes his boyish ideal of all that is good and true. He pictures her as beautiful and winsome and sweet. She is his heart's lady, and the thought of her abides within him as a safeguard and an inspiration. For her sake he resolves to make the most of himself and to live a clean, loyal life. When she comes to him, she must find his heart fit to receive her. There is never a time in his life when the dream of her does not gleam before him as of a star to which he may aspire with all reverence and love. The young man stopped abruptly and looked at the girl. She bent forward with shining eyes and touched his hand. "You are splendid," she said softly. "If he thought so, but no, I'm sure he doesn't. He's just coming out here like a martyr going to the stake. He knows he will be expected to propose to me when he gets here, and he knows that I know it too, and he knows, and I know, that I will be expected to say my prettiest yes. But aren't you going to say it?" asked the young man anxiously. The girl leaned forward. "No, that is my secret, and I'm going to say a most emphatic no. But won't your family make an awful row?" "Of course, but I rather enjoy a row now and then. It stirs up one's grey matter so nicely. I came out here this afternoon and thought the whole affair over from beginning to end, and I have determined to say no." "Oh, I wouldn't make it so irreconcilable as that," said the young man lightly. "I'd leave a loophole of escape. You see, if you were to like him a little better than you expected, it would be awkward to have committed yourself by a rash vow in saying no, wouldn't it?" "I suppose it would," said the girl thoughtfully. "But then, you know, I don't change my mind." "It's just as well to be on the safe side," said the young man. The girl got up. The rain was over and the sun was coming out through the mists. "Perhaps you are right," she said. "So I'll just resolve that I will say no if I don't want to say yes. That really amounts to the same thing, you know. Thank you so much for letting me tell you all about it. It must have bored you terribly, but it has done me so much good. I feel quite calm and rational now, and can go home and behave myself. Goodbye." "Goodbye," said the young man gravely. He stood on the pavilion and watched the girl out of sight beyond the pines. When the girl got home, she was told that the Dalhousie team had won the game 8-4. The girl dragged her hat off and waved it joyfully. "What a shame I wasn't there. They'd have gone mad over my dress." But the next item of information crushed her. The creature had arrived. He had called that afternoon and was coming to dinner that night. "How fortunate," said the girl as she went to her room that I relieved my mind to that young man out in the park today. If I had come back with all that pent-up feeling seething within me and heard this news right on top of it all, I might have flown into 1,000 pieces. Oh, what lovely brown eyes he had. I do dote on brown eyes. The creature will sure to have fishy blue ones. When the girl went down to meet the creature, she found herself confronted by the young man. For the first, last, and only time in her life, the girl had not a word to say. But her family thought her confusion very natural and pretty. They really had not expected her to behave so well. As for the young man, his manner was flawless. Toward the end of dinner, when the girl was beginning to recover herself, he turned to her. "You know, I promised never to tell," he said. "Be sure you don't, then," said the girl meekly. "But aren't you glad you left a loophole?" he persisted. The girl smiled down into her lap. "Perhaps," she said. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.